we want to be careful about understanding what the net positive or net negative impacts are of the cash transfer, not just the one side of the story.
Welcome to VoxDevTalks. My name is Tim Phillips. What are the price impacts of cash transfer programs? Do they raise prices as well as incomes? And what's the impact on people in the community who don't receive the transfer? Well, several recent papers have attempted to answer these important questions for specific transfer programs. Eeshani Kandpal of the Centre for Global Development is one of the researchers who has investigated this topic. She joins me now. Eeshani, welcome to VoxDevTalks.
Hi, Tim.
Eeshani, in an ideal world, if the program's working well, what's the positive effect of cash transfers?
We know a lot about conditional cash transfers in particular, but also unconditional cash transfers and their long and short run benefits. These can include poverty reduction, including in the long run, which we know best about from the Mexican conditional cash transfer program called Progresa, which is one of the oldest, and therefore we know both the most about it and also the most about its long-term impacts. It can also increase children's school enrollment and attendance, can sometimes, many times, not always though, have impacts on learning outcomes as well. It can improve health outcomes among beneficiary households, both for the targeted individuals, that's both adults and children, but also other non-targeted individuals, again, both adults and children within households where someone is receiving a cash transfer. We know about this from a range of settings. One that comes to mind is the South African Older Persons Grant, which Esther Duflo, among others, has studied and has shown the impact of grandmothers getting the cash transfer on grandchildren, on their health and schooling outcomes. And we know that it can lead to significant multipliers at the economy level even. We know this again from Progresa, but more recently from work looking at the Give Directly transfer in Kenya.
And why is it so important to understand what we're going to be talking about today, the price effects of these transfers?
Price effects fall into a broader class of effects called general equilibrium effects of cash transfers, right? So what is it doing at the economy-wide level? And we know, for instance, from the Give Directly work that is done by Dennis Egger and co-authors published in Econometrica recently, which shows a sizable multiplier. So, for every dollar that is transferred into the local economy by Give Directly, it generates almost $2 in economy-wide additional economic activity. Now, of course, if there is money being pumped into a local economy and that is leading to all this additional economic activity, there's greater demand for certain goods and services, people have more disposable income, we want to ask if there are impacts, not necessarily broadly based inflation, but if there are inflationary impacts on any sorts of prices, because that gives us a sense of the net effect of the cash transfer, right? So the general equilibrium effects are great to quantify, but if at the same time some prices at least also go up, we want to be careful about understanding what the net positive or net negative impacts are of the cash transfer, not just the one side of the story.
I see, if you're making people richer, but you're also making things more expensive.
You might be.
Yeah.
It stands to reason that you might be. And at the very least, we should be asking whether we are, and we should be looking to see whether there are price effects. Because if there are, we have to wonder how high the price effects are. What are the prices that are going up? And that in itself can call for certain policy responses. And so we need to sort of understand where additional policy interventions might be needed.
Well, talking of policy responses, you speak to policymakers. Is what we're discussing today, these price effects, is this something that they really want to know about?
The canonical policymaker that lives in our heads only lives in our heads, isn't it?
Yeah.
Policymakers are a diverse lot, and I have certainly worked with several who are interested in this question. Again, because they want to understand whether policy is working as intended. And general equilibrium effects have largely been thought of, I would say, sort of until this Econometrica paper that we just talked about, as an unintended consequence. And it's only now that we understand how important they can be, and they are used, for instance, by GiveWell and Give Directly to justify cash transfers to a great extent. But at the same time, policymakers want to understand what the total impact of their intervention is, of the dollars being transferred is. And in certain settings, for example, in the Middle East, where food price increases have been linked to civil unrest, for instance. There are many reasons to want to understand whether there are price effects or not. And certainly, those policymakers in particular tend to be more cognizant of these sorts of impacts or the potential for these sorts of impacts and more interested in averting them to the extent possible.
Now, you mentioned Egger et al., recently published. We will give all the references at the end. Are there other pieces of work that are targeting this question?
Yes. So there is an older study that looks at the Mexican in-kind supplement to the conditional cash transfer that is done by Jesse Cunha, Giacomo De Giorgi, and Seema Jayachandran that was published in the Review of Economic Studies in 2019. And I have some work as well that has looked at these sorts of price effects of conditional cash transfers.
And is all the work finding the same result? What's the consensus on this?
So there isn't a consensus per se. The results are, in fact, a bit at odds at times. And some of the thinking I've done on this question is really to understand how we can generalize and what we can generalize about where to expect price effects from cash transfers, to what extent and on what goods and services.
So, Eeshani, if we can't generalize, and that means that these effects are context-specific, what context are we talking about? What might matter?
I think the consensus in the literature so far has been that it is context-specific. And I think we can say a bit more than that. We can start characterizing the types of contexts where we might expect these sorts of price effects. And I like to characterize them using a few different dimensions. The first is remoteness. So the more remote a local market, the less integrated it is with the bigger market, the more you might expect even small influxes or relatively small influxes of cash to have at least a short-term effect on prices, because supply will take longer to respond because of the remoteness itself, right? Another dimension to think about is, what are the prices that we expect to be affected, particularly after a few months have passed, after a few months of the cash transfer? Certainly not things that are easy to transport, things that are not perishable, that have low transportation costs. We don't expect those prices to go up. And in my work in the Philippines, where we have documented the clearest instance of these sorts of price effects of a conditional cash transfer, this is work with Dion Filmer, Jet Friedman, and Junko Onishi, we show that it's prices of perishable foods that went up as a result of the cash transfer, and only in remote areas in the Philippines. So by perishable foods, we're talking about things like fresh eggs, fresh meat and fish, and some dairy products. Those are the sorts of things where you might expect the supply response to increased demand from the conditional cash transfer to be imperfect, for that transportation cost to introduce a bit of a wedge that never really fully goes away, that can stay. In our case, we document the slightly higher prices even over about a 36-month time horizon.
Now, some cash transfers happen for a relatively short time. Some happen, well, more or less forever. Does that matter?
Yes, there are characteristics of the cash transfer itself that determine the extent of the price effects that they might have. There's the permanence of the cash transfer, as you alluded to, and, people can respond differently to cash transfers that are advertised as being a one-off, like the Give Directly shock that we talked about, versus conditional cash transfers that are more a part of the safety net of the country and that are viewed as ongoing or a permanent income shock to these households. There's lots of good work looking at this. A study that I really appreciate that looks at this question compares the effects of changes in the U.S. Social Security payment across states to changes in consumption behavior resulting from the stimulus after the 2008 recession. This is work by Stephen Pennings that was published in the American Economic Review. And yet, when we think about that sort of evidence that comes from low and middle income countries, as opposed to this study by Stephen Pennings in the US, the effects of permanent cash transfer can be different in low and middle income countries. There's work by Sam Bazzi and co-authors that shows this. But still, the permanence of the cash transfer itself is a dimension to keep in mind. Another one is the size of the cash transfer, right? So most cash transfers are about 20 to 25% of household income transferred once every quarter, typically. In contrast, the Give Directly cash transfer is a one-time, so not a permanent, but also an 18-month income shock all at once. So a bit of an apples and oranges comparison to your typical social safety net that is studied in this literature.
Explain to me what we found so far on permanence. What's going to happen if it becomes part of ongoing support for people? What is the price effect of that?
The evidence from low and middle income countries is that households use conditional cash transfers and social safety net payments. So this is the work by Sambasi and co-authors that I talked about, to smooth consumption in a way that would be consistent with the permanent income hypothesis. Less so in high income countries where households don't show the same sort of consumption smoothing behavior in response to even longer term safety nets. But you might have a bit more of a consumption response in a low and middle income country setting in response to a longer term cash transfer. Whereas a lumpy and larger cash transfer, such as the one study, the Give Directly work, might lead to maybe more of an investment response. And that might generate some of those economy-wide effects in terms of knock-on effects on employment, for instance.
Now, one of the reasons why researchers are able to study these context-specific effects is because a lot of these programs happen in one place at one time. Of course, if they tend to work well, you want to scale them up. What do we know about scaling up? Specifically, is there a sort of Goldilocks scale up, the right pace at which to do it so that you minimize any negative price effects?
So program saturation is the intensity of the treatment, if you will, in the local market, and the pace of scale up, how rapidly the program is scaled up, are two other aspects that we need to keep in mind when thinking about the context. The Give Directly paper that we've talked about, the Mexican instance that was documented by Jesse Cunha and co-authors, and some other work that we haven't talked about yet, but that looks at the Malawian Public Works Program by Kathleen Beagle, Jessica Goldberg, and Emmanuel Galasso, all look at saturation level, as sort of the village level, the local market level, of about 1/3 to a half at most. In the Philippines, which is the one instance where we document these sorts of price increases as a result of a cash transfer, we're looking at median saturation levels of about 65%, which is to say that about 65% of the village received the program pretty much from the get-go. And in some areas, and particularly remote areas that tend to be poor, like every safety net, this is means targeted. So the greater the program saturation, the poorer the village. That's essentially what it means. So in the most remote and poor areas, up to 95% of the village is receiving the cash transfer. So for the 5 to 35% of the village that isn't receiving the cash transfer, they're nominally non-poor. They're above that targeting threshold for that program, but they're still quite vulnerable in real terms. Poverty threshold in the Philippines was set at about $2 per day per capita.
Oh, right. You certainly wouldn't call them rich. Yes.
Exactly. They're quite vulnerable, right? And so it stands to reason that if you're in that excluded 5 to 35% and the village goes from no one receiving the cash transfer to 65 to 95% of it receiving it within a few months, that is quite a rapid and large shock on these households, and they struggle to respond, to adjust consumption. And what we can document in this instance is that these price effects led to an increase in stunting rates among children that were not born into the program. And that is again tied to the reduction in consumption of eggs and dairy and other protein-rich foods by these households. To answer your question, there isn't a Goldilocks pace of scale up, but if you are scaling up and if you are going to be treating much of the village in remote and poor areas, consider geographic targeting, at least in the short run. Consider covering the entire village in the remotest parts of the country rather than just a few households. And leave yourself room to work on things like supply chains, to work on road infrastructure. There's a great paper by David Atkin and Dave Donaldson that looks at price differences between port of entry and interior markets in low and middle income countries versus in high income countries, and finds that in low and middle income countries, that price difference between port of entry and the interior markets is, if memory serves, about 3 times greater than what it is in high income countries. That, I think, is a nice way of quantifying the importance of thinking about supply chains and how they are incomplete and missing. And so if you do scale up too quickly, you don't leave yourself the ability to work on those other complementary inputs as well. So it's not just about the cash, it's about everything else that those markets need to be able to respond to the cash.
So, Eeshani, I want you to imagine that you're with a policymaker, and it's one of the policymakers that's really interested in these price effects, and you were going to give her some warnings about the things that could potentially go wrong. Obviously, scale-up pace is one of those. What would be the others?
I would say think about, again, saturation. And so if you're going to be means targeting this and you identify particularly poor communities, don't household target, geographically target. You can still means target, just at a higher level. And I would say, think about what the important sources of nutrition are in those communities. So in the Philippines, again, we can tie these price effects to reductions in children's nutritional status, primarily because there are no or very few non-perishable protein sources in these communities.
Right. Yeah.
And so, for example, the Philippines is a particularly tough example because it's a tough context because of the high levels of lactose intolerance. But in other communities, if you're worried about price effects, for instance, affecting protein-rich foods that might in turn have effects on children's nutritional outcomes, think about things like powdered milk, which are non-perishable, nutrient-rich substitute. There might be an in-kind complement to consider in those sorts of settings. I would say think about the supply chain. Think about where roads are poor and where they might affect the supply response. That would otherwise normally happen, right? If prices go up, there should be a supply response to that. And I would say think about not having a cash transfer that is fading in and out, that is advertised as and known by the community as being a longer term investment in the community.
And to learn the things that we need to know about these very serious questions, what research do we need to do?
First and foremost, I think we need to be thinking about the price effects on perishables versus non-perishables.
Yeah.
So just reporting impacts on the overall food basket, for instance, is not sufficient. I think we need to be thinking about what are the prices. And again, the perishable ones are the ones that we expect to be affected by conditional cash transfers. And so we should measure them and report them separately from the overall food CPI, if you will. If you look at our overall food CPI in the Philippines, it goes up by about 1.15%. And if memory serves, in the Egger et al. Paper, we're talking about a price increase of approximately 1%. So, again, at the overall food CPI level, very comparable. It's just that we then dig in to the effects on perishables. And we need to measure saturation carefully. One of the reasons that we can tie these price effects to the Philippine Conditional Cash Transfer Program is because we have, in the treated villages, program saturation, again, which is to say the share of the village that received the transfer. And in the control villages, we have that same measure, the counterfactual, or what would have been the saturation level. And so we can compare households that are above that poverty threshold in treated villages at a given level of saturation to households that are above the poverty threshold level in the control villages at the same level of counterfactual saturation. That degree of granularity where you have the proxy means test score for every household in treatment and control villages and you're able to compare like to like hasn't always been the case. And as a result, we are not able to tie these effects, I think, sometimes as cleanly as we are able to in the Philippine case. And last, to repeat an earlier point I made about prices, this is something that affects us as well to some extent, is the data that we collect to evaluate conditional cash transfer programs tend to be somewhat limited. We've always thought about the direct effects of these conditional cash transfer programs, and the surveys that we do are typically focused on the household and the impacts on the household. We're not doing very detailed price surveys, for instance. So market level price surveys, which I understand the Give Directly study has in Kenya, as well as richer, at least, production impacts at the household level, measuring those. Are you responding to the cash transfer, whether you're receiving it or your household that's above the poverty threshold, by investing in certain types of livelihoods a little bit more? Those sorts of data to really understand these GE effects, now that we understand how important they are, I think are really important and things that we haven't really looked at. And last but not the least, the ability to tie these back to measures of local infrastructure. And here we were very fortunate in the Philippines to have a measure of remoteness and of the village development level, if you will. That's not always the case. The Philippines is a relatively data-rich environment. But to be able to have those sorts of data, to really have a very complete sense of what's happening, not just on the targeted outcomes in the targeted households, but in the community writ large, I think is really what we need to be moving toward.
We obviously need to know a lot more, but as you point out, we have some insights already. Is there evidence that this knowledge is being operationalized to innovate, to improve the transfer programs that exist today?
in the early months of the COVID pandemic, several program teams of the World Bank's Social Protection Department reached out to me. I worked at the World Bank at the time to ask how to design a program that would not have these sorts of price effects. And that was teams that were primarily from the Middle East and North Africa region, where there is a history of political strife resulting from high food prices. So, a region where they're particularly sensitive to these sorts of pressures.
Yes.
And they are thinking about geographic targeting. They are thinking about in-kind transfers. There's a cash transfer in Lebanon in particular that I think is really the forefront of being sensitive to the nutritional impacts, but also to the price effects. In more recent work I have done with Mark Belmer and Katerina Thomas, where we aggregate data from a number of conditional cash transfers around the world to look at the effects on food demand. We actually find that despite all of these nutrition sensitive dimensions, you're targeting the cash transfer to women as opposed to men within the household under the assumption that they're going to invest more in children's food and education, for instance, having nutritional counseling sessions. Despite all of that, the impacts on the average household from this sort of an ongoing safety net of about 15 to 25% leads to very modest impacts on demand for nutrition in particular. Food demand might respond a bit more overall, but the impacts on protein demand can still be quite muted in many communities. If we want to be getting the most bang for our buck, we really need to be thinking about how to also highlight the importance of a nutrient-rich diet, not just, additional demand for food, but really thinking about what are the gaps in nutritional outcomes and how can we fill them in more innovative ways that complement that cash transfer.
Yes, you talk about bang for the buck. We've spoken a lot today about what we don't know and perhaps opportunities that haven't been taken as a result. What's the reward here, though? What might happen if we use our knowledge to implement transfer programs well?
I think it's about value for money. We understand that conditional cash transfers and unconditional cash transfers are a very effective means of targeting certain outcomes among certain households. What we don't want to do is be undermining those effects by leading to negative impacts on other households, as we found in the Philippines. In fact, in the Philippines, we study 130 villages, and in 8 out of 130 villages, the average impact on children's nutrition is negative. Because those price increases so adversely affected the children not born into the program that it actually wiped out the gains at the village level on the children who did receive the conditional cash transfer. And it is possible to avoid it, again, by things like geographic targeting, by slow, intentional scale-up, by using in-kind transfers to complement and protect the nutritional component of children's diets in particular. And it's really ensuring that you're not eroding the gains or undermining them by these sorts of unintended consequences. The reward is a program that works as designed, as intended.
Eeshani, thank you very much.
Thanks, Tim.
Now, as you've heard, we've got a lot of references today. I'm going to go through some of them, and then maybe Eeshani can help me with the ones I've missed out. So the paper, Cash Transfers, Food Prices and Nutrition Impacts on Ineligible Children. That's Eeshani's research with Dion Filmer, Jed Friedman and Junko Onishi. That was published in the Review of Economics and Statistics, Volume 105, Number 2, 2023. And Eeshani has already written something about this for VoxDev, the article How Cash Transfers Can Have Negative Impact on Non-Beneficiaries, Evidence from the Philippines. That was in 2021. Now, also, Egger et al., as we have been referring to it, General Equilibrium Effects of Cash Transfers, Experimental Evidence from Kenya. Econometrica 90, number 6, that was 2022. The price effects of cash versus in-kind transfers, that's Kunya, De Giorgi and Jayachandran, that was mentioned early on. Review of Economic Studies, 86 number 1, 2019. Eeshani, are there other ones that I've missed out?
Tim, I'd love to highlight a couple of other papers. One is called The Direct and Indirect Effects of Malawi's Public Works Program on Food Security, as I mentioned, by Kathleen Beagle, Emanuela Galasso, and Jessica Goldberg in the Journal of Development Economics, 2017, volume 128. As well as this working paper of mine, which is a CGD working paper, and you can find it on my website. It is called Income and the Demand for Food Among the Poor. It is with Mark Belmer and Katerina Thomas.
This has been a VoxDev Talk. The best way to make sure you don't miss an episode, subscribe. You find us wherever you get your podcasts. Our past episodes, as always, are at VoxDev.org. If you like what you hear, please leave us a review and tell someone else about us.